the thing that we haven't touched on that ties into all of that, and education will kind of factor in also, is in our community, back to what I said about poverty being traumatizing. We're traumatized by poverty, and the biggest part of the trauma is, especially from the male side, high ego and low self-esteem is a conflict. So what starts to happen is, it's almost like back to playing to the lower end of ourselves. Instead of trying, you would use the poverty as an excuse. So, you know, I do this, and I did this again, more adversarial when I was younger, but I would get into conversations with drug dealers, and especially guys that came from my neighborhood, especially the ones that were younger, because I saw the turning point. I saw them go from wanting to play football, basketball, or whatever their dream was in 6th grade, 7th grade, and then somewhere around puberty, 8th grade, they start waking up with erections and seeing girls in different ways, and all of a sudden, you're starting to change, your vibe is changing, your energy is changing, and now your priorities start to change. Because now your innocence is lost, and now you start to care about these things that you didn't care about when you were younger. So once that innocence is lost, then the thought, I'm just doing what I gotta do. Then you start to hear these kind of words. And I said, again, you're saying you're doing what you gotta do, but if you really break that down, what makes you say you have to do that? With all of the options on the table in terms of what you can do, and I always go back to Malcolm X and Martin and just the era that this next generation didn't live through. I was too young to actually live through it, but I still felt the after effects of it. I understood the 70s, James Brown saying I'm black and I'm proud. I understood what that meant. I understood watching the dashiki versus the pimp clothing. I understood the Afro pick. There's a whole lot of things that were happening in the 70s that when hip hop came into being, many of us, especially from that first generation, we lived through enough of it so we still had some of it with us. By the time it got to the late 80s, that next generation, if you were born in 70, you're 9 years old when Rappers Delight comes out in 79, and you might not have been paying attention because your puberty is starting in the mid 80s. So the same thing is happening in that cycle. So what starts to happen is, back to that same thing about making dumb cool. For whatever reason, the guy that didn't do his homework had an aggression on him. Now probably, 9 times out of 10, could be not eating at home, could be the broken home syndrome, could be a lot of things that's stopping him from doing it. Not that he doesn't have the aptitude, but his attitude is now acclimating to the situation and his circumstance. And instead of saying, I'm late because my mother was drunk or my father didn't come home or whatever, my clothes are wrinkled because the lights are off, he's coming in like nobody better not say nothing and mess with me. That's the ego part. And there's a viciousness simultaneously, that crabs in the barrel thing that we come from also. There's a viciousness where the guy that is doing a little better is not trying to let you off the hook. So now this lack of love that he's talking about, he may not even want. I remember very clearly, my group, Treacherous 3, we would put blazers on because we were trying to be the OJs. we had a different frame of reference. So for people to look at us like, who do you think you are to put a blazer on? Now, we don't have money, but we going to AJ lessons. We going to try to piece it together the best we can. So we ain't got no tailors. Suits don't even really fit right, but we putting a suit on because we going to look different because we trying to send a different signal. And on the one hand, and this is back to that spiritual currency part, the thing that I always said, we relied on it and really, really trusted it, especially for young African-American men. Not that I'm excluding the women, but definitely from the alpha male, that ego, low self-esteem thing. If we understood the spirit, the haterism that we all call it or whatever, no. Usually, real talent is responded to in a way that we are all going to respond to Michael Jackson. There's nothing you can do about that. And if you broke Michael Jackson down and saw some of the stuff that he wore and what he looked like or whatever, if anybody else is doing that, it'd be like, wow, that's really corny. But his spirit was so powerful in terms of what he was doing. And this is what I say with our connectivity. Nobody told me that Apache was something that you were supposed to dance to. And when hip hop is first starting, and this is what I mean back to this whole thing because I'm tying education in, the fact that I was still in high school and most of us were still in high school, the guys that were dropping out weren't participating in the same level. And you could tell the difference in an MC's education just based on the vocabulary, just based on the words that he used. And I remember going through all of that and being heralded because what started happening is the elders in the community started giving props to those that went to school or went to college or whatever. And we had to start to undo, which hip hop did in many ways, started undoing that stigma of going to college meant you were a nerd. Like we had a lot of downtrodden thought processes that put us in spaces. So by the time we got to 89 and I finally did have big hit records and #1 records on the radio and Arsenio Hall came and we got a chance to sit down and talk. And then the world was like, I mean, I literally remember a guy at Paramount, I was up for a TV show, and he's like, he didn't know how to finish the sentence. He said, "You speak so well for," and he couldn't finish the sentence. Because he just hadn't experienced that in terms of what we were supposed to be representing. The fact that I had a college degree, I remember there were segments of the hip hop community that tried to make that like, oh, he has to be a cornball, something has to be wrong, it can't be whatever. And until getting in those forums or whatever, I'm like, it's almost like what Snoop did at the New York Awards. He said, "You know y'all love me." Like kind of what you did with Puffy. So even if you're gonna try to outcast me because I went to school, like you kind of tell me you don't love me. It's no way you don't love me for doing what I'm doing and you want to do what I do. You're watching me at a certain level, but you don't have enough heart to say, I don't have the money to invest in the clothing this way, so what I'm gonna do is take this downtrodden look and make it fashionable, which is the genius to that on a certain level. So, but on the other side of it, being stuck there and glorifying it is where the problem comes, because the thing that we worship and idolize in the hustler from an emotional standpoint, not spiritual, but from an emotional standpoint is we understand the plight, we understand the journey, we relate to the materialism that goes with it. We also understand simultaneously is, but you're killing your neighborhood while you're doing this, so we can't really root for you. So at the same time, the kids that are coming up watching these drug dealers and these hustlers, the guys that have all the material accolades, at the end of the day, we're not seeing enough of the quote unquote doctors and the lawyers. And I remember again, the Huxtables coming on and all of the flack that they got saying that that's not reality. It still goes to that thing about our scope. There's way more of us in college. There's way more of us doing good. If you broke down just hip hop right now, you would think that 90% of Black America is hustling, selling drugs in a strip club, and that is just the infinitesimal side of the equation, because in New York, the trains are packed every single morning with millions of people going to work. The block, and any block, if you got 400 apartments on there, it may be 2 drug dealers in the neighborhood, and they'll say that's a drug neighborhood. But what's happening is the average person that lives in that building and in those neighborhoods are going to work. They're going to school. But we're not counting it that way because, as Bush would say, fuzzy math back in the day, what you're doing is you're taking the lowest end of the spectrum and defining us by that lower end of the spectrum where most of us understand going to school, getting a job, and that is the journey. So what education plays a part in is for me, it's more about the personalities. Not that I would ever talk bad about the guys that made it without it, but there are tons of people like Chuck D, Kid from Kid and Play, even Latifah. There are tons of guys that went to school, but they don't put it in the bio as though it's not important. And I think that's the part that we need to start doing. We need to start talking about how many of us actually go through. And just the last part of that, if you broke down what goes on behind the scenes, the guys that's doing videos, the technical side of whatever, you're going to have to learn something. We constantly focus on the LeBron James or the guy that has a super uber talent that can come out and be an usher or that's one part of it, but everybody has a stylist, everybody has a manager, if you start looking at the diaspora of what it is, you'll see that education is going to play a part in 90% of those other jobs that are not in the spotlight. So it's really, really more about the education in that sense.